There's a lot of work that goes into creating a podcast. You have to iterate, test things, you have to get comfortable with the format. It all takes time. And if management doesn't understand this up front, you'll constantly face an uphill battle.
Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, I'm Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. The show is brought to you by my company, Motion. We are a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Podcasting is a great way to build a relationship with your ideal customers. At Motion, we view a company's podcast as a conversation flywheel. And for many of the tech companies we work with, it fuels their company's entire content marketing strategy. But not all companies are able to produce a podcast consistently. For a few key reasons, we've seen companies fail after the distribution of the first few episodes. The majority of podcasts don't even make it to the 7th episode. And they end up suffering from a term called Podfade. And these companies either give up podcasting altogether, or they come to a company like ours to help them get through it. In this episode, I'm going to cover the top 5 reasons a company's podcast fails, and how your marketing team can avoid Podfade and produce a consistent podcast. The first major reason a company's podcast fails is because the company relies too much on a single person to produce the show. It takes a lot of different skill sets to produce a company's podcast. If your marketing team wants to get the most out of a video podcast, you need a lot of different skills. Things like podcast strategy, graphic design, script development, podcast guest outreach and coordination, audio editing, video editing. The list really goes on and on. It's rare to find all of these things wrapped up into one person. But a lot of companies still try to assign all of these different things to a single individual. And in most cases, they rely too much on one person and don't establish processes to scale or transfer the workflow. Then when the sole podcast resource finds a new opportunity and submits their resignation, it takes too much effort to build out the processes needed to pick up the podcast and carry it forward. So as a result, the company publishes the few episodes that are already in the can, and the podcast just fades away. The second reason we see podcasts fail is when leadership doesn't get it and focuses too much on downloads in the beginning. One of the biggest red flags we see during discovery calls is when a prospect says, "What type of download metrics can we expect to see in the first few months?" When your company's leadership starts off the podcasting journey with a focus on downloads, you're going to fail. Your podcast will fail because it'll never really have a chance to succeed in the first place. There's a lot of work that goes into creating a podcast. You have to iterate, test things, you have to get comfortable with the format. It all takes time. And if management doesn't understand this up front, you'll constantly face an uphill battle. Now, the third reason podcasts fail is when the marketing team doesn't repurpose content and distribute it effectively. When we work with customers, we help them implement a 3-phased approach to podcast distribution. Let me just go through those 3 phases real quick for you. The first is repurpose and breakdown. This involves the development of a variety of podcast assets to share across different distribution channels. An episode is repurposed to audio, video, and written content. Second is distribute. In this phase, the marketing team focuses primary distribution channels, and these include your company's social profiles, website, podcast platforms. And the third phase is enrich. During this phase, your team starts to bolster other marketing content with the assets created from your podcast episodes. Your team can embed video clips and blog posts, create ads from interviews, and use podcast snippets and email campaigns, just as an example. Podfade typically creeps in when a company doesn't get the most out of each episode. So rather than using their show as a way to drive their content marketing strategy, companies create an MP3 file and upload it to their podcast hosting platform. Then, after 5 or 6 episodes, the podcast gets canceled because there's not enough ROI. Now, the fourth biggest reason podcasts fail is because the podcast doesn't help an ideal audience. When we launch a podcast for a tech company, We encourage them to answer two major questions as part of their overarching podcast strategy. Who is the show for, and how does it help them? Podcasts fail when one or both of these questions aren't answered. The show fails because it's aimless, really, and teams can't use the content to support the company's revenue. When podcast episodes can't be used to help customers across marketing, sales, and even customer success teams, then you'll have a tough time maintaining the show. It'll really just be a passion project with a limited lifeline. The fifth biggest reason we see podcasts fail is when the show relies on external guests too much. One of the best ways to establish a foundation for your company's podcast is with an interview style format. Many of our customers start off this way as well. The show gets off the ground using a single host who is responsible for interviewing industry experts, prospects, and customers. But then companies often run into a problem when they can't coordinate the schedules with guests fast enough. Teams then face a major bottleneck that's hard to recover from. You get behind in the schedule, you struggle to find guests, and then the podcast falls down the priority list. Now, even though it may seem like there are a lot of reasons a podcast fails, each major obstacle can be overcome if you know what options are available to you. As of right now, we produce nearly 50 different shows for B2B organizations. Most of them are tech companies, and we have quite a bit of experience helping companies navigate these types of challenges to create breakthrough shows. So let me share some of the ways you can prevent podfade. The first big thing, make one person accountable, but stack talent. Successful podcasts are resource intensive, and if you want to keep your show running, you need to make sure you have the right people in the right seats. The best way to ensure your podcast keeps running is to limit the risk you have with one person. If your team relies too much on the skills of a single resource, then you need to change up your approach. The companies that have the longest running shows have two key approaches to resources. The first approach is to make one person accountable for the show. So rather than piling the entire workload on one person, companies make one person accountable for the workflow. Essentially, this person is the project manager or producer, and they're responsible for checking off each task. They're not necessarily responsible for editing or hosting. Their job is just to make sure everything gets done. The second approach is to stack different types of talent using a variety of internal and external resources. Because there are so many different skills involved with podcast production, it helps to divide and conquer. The companies that have success use several internal resources or hire a podcast agency to execute the creative work. This approach limits the exposure your team has if one resource in the company leaves, and it also helps to avoid burnout when there's too much work piled on one person. The second big thing to do to prevent podfade is to make sure you develop a podcast theme statement. Podcast listeners have a lot of options. There are hundreds of thousands of shows out there, and buyers have so many choices to get information. It's a crowded field. In order for your company's podcast to cut through the noise, you need to then stand out. You need to be specific. The best shows, supported by brands, have a very clear mission. At Motion, we call this a theme statement. When we produce shows for tech companies, we work with marketing teams to craft a theme statement, and this becomes a big part of the strategic action plan. The theme clearly identifies who the podcast is for and how it helps them. The theme statement is used in a lot of different places, like the podcast description, which you see in all the different podcast apps. Use it in guest guidelines, on the website, within the pre-recorded intro and outro. And when you have a very specific theme statement, it makes it easier to create episodes for your listeners. Every single conversation you have relates back to the theme. A third key thing to do to prevent podfade is to establish clear objectives for your show before you launch. If your CEO asks you, how many downloads can we expect within the first 90 days, then you need to do a better job establishing objectives up front. Before you record your first episode, you need to make sure everyone has realistic expectations. Once you have a rock-solid theme for your podcast, it's important to outline these objectives. And the objectives aren't just for your marketing team. They're also key for setting the tone with management as well. So how do you set clear objectives for your podcast? Well, every major initiative should have a why, and a podcast is no different. The objectives of a podcast usually fall into a few buckets. First, the increased efficiency in content marketing by adding repurposed written, audio, and video content. Another one is improved quality, consistency, and variety of content. Another is connecting with and featuring the best and brightest people in your space. And then also creating relationships with target accounts and developing content that enables sales and customer success teams. Identify the major reasons your company is producing a show and create metrics that make sense for your objectives. Don't forget, objectives aren't measured just with numbers. A lot of times it's the qualitative feedback that helps keep your show going. Save screenshots of comments, emails, reviews, and any other feedback you receive so you can share them with your executives. Another big thing to overcome Podfade is to create once and distribute forever. When your team puts a lot of research and effort into a podcast episode, you owe it to yourself to make sure you spend the time to distribute it effectively. Don't just generate an MP3 file and upload it to Buzzsprout and then put the MP4 on YouTube. Instead, focus on getting the most out of each conversation. This includes creating audio, video, and written content. When you commit to producing a podcast for your company, make sure you establish a list of assets for each episode. Create a publishing schedule and stick to it. If you want to prevent Podfade, make sure you collaborate with other members of your organization as well. Most content gets created in a silo, whether it's a blog post, video, or even a company's social post. With a podcast, you can break down those silos in your organization and get several different teams involved with content development. How do you do that? Well, a podcast allows you to work across different functions of your business and source ideas to help customers. When you involve other teams with your company's podcast, you do a few things. You create momentum and excitement. You produce content employees enjoy. You obtain fresh ideas from teams who are focused on the customer. And when you lead the podcast at your company, you build rapport with other team members. You demonstrate leadership yourself, and you naturally focus on the customer. The tech companies that I see with a successful podcast are often led by marketers who involve other teams within their organization, and they create an environment where everyone helps customers. And the last tip to overcome Podfade is to start with an interview-style show and introduce new formats along the way. So what if a guest cancels their recording session? Or what if you're having trouble coordinating a guest to come on your show each week? Should this really prevent you from having an active podcast? To avoid Podfade, because of guest issues, it's helpful to integrate other video podcast formats. Even though consistency is crucial to the success of your show, you don't have to conduct interviews for each and every episode. A podcast can power your company's entire content marketing strategy, and it can serve as the core foundation for all of your audio, written, and video content. In a recent episode of Recorded Content, I went through 6 different video podcast formats you can use for your company's podcast. Let me run these down for you right now. The first is an industry expert conversation. Second is a panel discussion or roundtable format. Third format is internal conversation with your company's subject matter experts. The fourth is a solo story. The fifth is reflection or remix episode. And the sixth is a live Q&A session. As of today, Listen Notes has over 130 million podcast episodes available in its database. But don't feel like you have to compete with this many episodes by doing the same thing each and every week. Focus on the strengths of you and your team and find one or more formats that work for your company. And I'll just end with this. If you've committed to doing a podcast and have gone through the launch process, don't give up. Put some of these things I've talked about today to work for you and keep your company's show out of the podcast graveyard. Well, that's all I have for today. Thanks for joining me on Recorded Content.
Thanks for listening to Recorded Content, a show brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcasting agency for B2B tech marketers. We do the podcast stuff so you can focus on strategy, building brand awareness, and developing new relationships. To learn more about how you can launch and grow a podcast for your company, check out motionagency.io. Thanks for listening to Recorded Content.